Good evening, and welcome back to another journey into the quieter, often forgotten corners of history. Tonight, instead of following emperors through their marble palaces or generals across the battlefield, we will walk among the nameless millions who formed the backbone of the Roman Empire. Their lives were not gilded with gold, nor carved into triumphal arches. They lived in cramped rooms, carried water through crowded streets, struggled with hunger, and clung to small joys that gave meaning to existence. And before we begin, I'd like to ask you, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it for you right now? As you think about that, try to imagine for a moment what it might feel like to step out of your modern home and into the bustling, smoky, noisy lanes of ancient Rome. This is not the story of emperors and armies. This is the story of how ordinary people survived, worked, ate, prayed, and endured in the vast machine of the Roman Empire. When people think of the Roman Empire, they imagine wealth and order, a civilization of aqueducts, paved roads, and amphitheaters. But beneath that polished surface was a harsher truth. Most Romans lived in poverty, in constant struggle to survive. Their lives were spent in small, crowded rooms, working endless hours for meager pay, while disease and danger lurked in every alley. For ordinary Romans, home usually meant the insula, a multi-storied apartment block packed tightly along narrow streets. These structures could rise 5 or 6 stories, leaning precariously against one another. The walls, built with cheap materials, cracked under the strain of age and weight. Collapses were not rare, and fire could spread through entire districts in a single night. The wealthier tenants sometimes rented the lower floors, which were sturdier and offered slightly larger rooms. But for most, life meant climbing steep staircases too small, airless cubicles, where entire families slept together on straw mattresses. Imagine one dark room, no bigger than a modern bedroom, with a cooking pot, a single oil lamp, and perhaps a chest to store clothes. That space might shelter 5 or 6 people. Water was not piped to these apartments. Families carried heavy jars from fountains, often queuing for their turn. On the walk back, the jar dug painfully into the shoulders, and if spilled, the effort began again. Waste disposal was equally primitive. Chamber pots were emptied into pits or, sometimes directly out of a window, into the street below. For passers-by, a hood or cloak was more than protection from rain. It was a shield against what might be dumped from above. The smell of these districts was overwhelming. Smoke from hearths clung to the walls, mixing with the stench of waste, rotting food, and sweat. In summer, when Rome sweltered under Mediterranean heat, the air itself seemed heavy with disease. Bread was life. Without bread, there was hunger, and without hunger's answer, riots followed. The Roman state distributed grain under the annona, but the queues were long, and supplies sometimes uncertain. Citizens received their ration, ground it, and baked it into coarse loaves. The bread grew stale quickly, but it kept families alive. A pot of barley porridge or bean stew might simmer in the corner of a room. For flavor, if they were lucky, families added oil or a dash of the infamous garamtha, pungent fish sauce made from fermented entrails. Garum smell, produced in vats along the coast, was unbearable to outsiders, but for Romans it was a cheap and vital source of taste. Meat was rare for ordinary households. A scrap of pork or chicken might appear during festivals, stretched across many plates. Otherwise, people relied on dried sausages, olives, figs, and whatever could be bought cheaply at market stalls. The streets of Rome were lined with thermopolia taverns, serving hot stews and bread. A hungry worker could lean against a marble counter, spooning down lentils or chickpeas, while traders and laborers argued around him. Wine, watered down heavily, was the common drink. Even children consumed it, since water drawn from fountains could be foul. For the poor, wine was a necessity not for pleasure, but for survival. Rome's grandeur rested on the backs of laborers. At dawn, the the streets filled with men carrying tools, hoping for day work. Porters hauled goods from the docks, builders carried bricks to endless construction sites, and slaves labored in workshops. Free men often found themselves competing with slaves, who worked without wages. A skilled craftsman, a potter, shoemaker, or carpenter might make a living, but many teetered on the edge of unemployment. Women worked too, selling vegetables in markets, weaving in workshops, or serving in taverns. Children were rarely spared. Boys helped fathers in manual labor, while girls were expected to tend to siblings, fetch water, and assist mothers in stalls. The idea of a carefree childhood was unknown. Survival demanded early responsibility. When dusk fell, the city changed. Oil lamps flickered faintly, but shadows swallowed alleys. Gangs lurked in corners, thieves stalked drunks, and violence was common. The vigils Rome's night watch patrolled the streets, doubling as firefighters, but they were too few for such a vast city. In the insulate, families bolted doors and huddled together. Fires often broke out in kitchens or lamps tipped by accident, spreading from one apartment to another. The fear of flame was as constant as the fear of crime. Rome's sewers, though advanced compared to many civilizations, served mostly the wealthy districts. In poor neighborhoods, filth covered the streets. Rats thrived, feeding on scraps and waste. Water supplies, drawn from fountains and wells, often carried contamination. Illnesses swept through the population relentlessly. Fevers, dysentery, and skin diseases were common, while outbreaks of more lethal plagues struck in waves. Without modern medicine, people relied on herbs, charms, and home remedies. Doctors did exist, but their services were expensive and often unreliable. Childhood was especially fragile. Many infants died before their first birthday, and parents learned to live with grief as a constant presence. Cemeteries were filled with small graves, mute testimony to lives barely begun. Despite the misery, ordinary Romans craved entertainment. The state, aware of this, provided it freely. At the Colosseum, crowds roared as gladiators fought to the death. At the Circus Maximus, thousands screamed for their chariot teams, waving banners and gambling their few coins. For a few hours, poverty was forgotten. In those arenas, the shoemaker and the senator sat shoulder to shoulder, united by the thrill of spectacle. Bread in circuses panem, et circenses, kept the restless poor occupied. Religion filled the cracks left by hardship. Every household, no matter how poor, maintained a lararium, a small shrine with figures of household gods. Families lit oil lamps before them, offering prayers for food, health, and safety. Superstitions guided daily life. Amulets against the evil eye dangled from children's necks. Charms were buried beneath thresholds. Inscriptions scratched into lead tablets cursed rivals and prayed for justice. Festivals brought moments of joy. Processions, sacrifices, and feasts broke the monotony, allowing even the poorest to feel part of something larger. Religion, in all its forms, gave meaning and hope where life offered little. If one looks past the glitter of marble columns and triumphal arches, the Roman Empire was, at its heart, sustained by millions of people who lived without fame or inscription. These ordinary citizens, farmers, bakers, soldiers, artisans, and street sellers, were the invisible machinery of the empire's survival. Their days unfolded in a rhythm so steady that it rarely entered the official record. But it is in these rhythms that the true life of Rome may be found. Consider, for instance, the crowded Insulum multi-story apartment blocks that housed much of the urban population. A single building might cram in hundreds of tenants, from struggling laborers who rented the dim attic rooms, to slightly better-off shopkeepers who occupied the ground-floor units with direct access to the street. These structures, often built quickly and cheaply, leaned precariously against one another, and fires were a constant hazard. For many families, Climbing 4 or 5 flights of rickety wooden stairs each evening was part of the daily routine, the smell of smoke and cooking oil clinging to the stairwells. Inside such dwellings, possessions were sparse. A low wooden bed, perhaps a small chest for clothing, a clay lamp filled with olive oil, the basics of living. Walls were often bare, save for soot stains or patches of lime plaster. Yet, even here, life carried on. A mother might hum a lullaby as she stirred lentils over a small charcoal brazier. Children played with clay dolls, tossing them in the dust of the courtyard. The sounds of neighbors' arguments, laughter, the hammering of a cobbler drifted constantly through the thin walls. Privacy, as we know it, scarcely existed. Meanwhile, in the countryside, life was slower but no less demanding. Vast estates owned by senators and wealthy elites dominated the landscape. Yet woven between these were countless small farms run by free peasants. They rose at dawn, guided their oxen through furrowed fields, and watched the cycle of crops dictate the pace of their year. Wheat and barley were staples, but vineyards and olive groves also stretched across the hillsides. Their harvests destined not only for local consumption, but for markets as far away as the northern provinces. For these farmers, prosperity depended heavily on weather, pests, and the tax collector. A poor yield meant tightening belts, watering down wine, and patching old tunics for another season. Taxes were, in truth, one of the most pressing realities of Roman life. Whether one lived in an Italian town or a distant provincial village, obligations to the state loomed large. Grain levies, tribute payments, or even labor service could swallow much of a family's surplus. The machinery of empire, the legions, the aqueducts, the roads was funded not by the wealth of emperors alone, but by the relentless contributions of ordinary households. Inscriptions survive of villages petitioning governors for tax relief after bad harvests, revealing a fragile balance between survival and ruin. Social identity, too, shaped daily existence. A freedman, once enslaved, might now operate a workshop or manage a tavern, but his status was always marked in law and custom. The clothing one wore: a plain tunic for the laborer, a toga for the citizen, a stola for the respectable matron, was itself a statement of class and belonging. For women, roles were circumscribed by household duties and family honor. Yet inscriptions reveal that some managed businesses donated to civic projects or commissioned tombstones for their loved ones, small but enduring fingerprints of their presence. Religion permeated every corner of life. Shrines stood at street corners. Household gods, Lares and Penates, received offerings at kitchen hearths, and festivals punctuated the year with public feasting and ritual. For the average Roman, the divine was not distant, but intimately woven into everyday tasks: lighting a lamp, planting a seed, setting out on a journey. Even misfortune, sudden illness, a collapsed roof, was read as a sign that the gods required attention. In this sense, piety was less an occasional duty than a continual negotiation with unseen forces. Markets were another stage on which ordinary existence played out. The hum of bargaining, the cries of hawkers selling olives, fish, or cheap trinkets, and the smell of spices or freshly baked bread created a sensory tapestry of the Roman street. Coins changed hands constantly: bronze asses and silver, denarii, passing from farmers to bakers to moneylenders in a ceaseless cycle. A day at the market was not only about sustenance, it was about community, gossip, and the subtle measure of one's fortunes against those of neighbors. Yet, beneath all this, there remained vulnerability. Ordinary people lived with the constant awareness that stability was fragile. A fire might sweep through an insula, a bad harvest could empty cupboards, a military levy might take a son from the fields. Even in times of peace, the empire demanded resilience from its citizens. And so, survival became its own quiet triumph, marked not by monuments or triumphal processions, but by the simple continuation of life from one day into the next. The question of health was one of the most pressing realities for ordinary Romans. Though they lacked the vocabulary of modern medicine, a simple fever could prove fatal, and infections from minor cuts were feared as much as battlefield wounds. Remedies came from a mixture of inherited folk knowledge, herbal practices, and the writings of physicians such as Galen or Hippocrates, though professional medical care was a luxury few could afford. In rural villages, women often served as the first healers, using poultices of garlic, honey, or vinegar to draw out infection. In towns, apothecaries prepared ointments of resin and crushed herbs, their shops heavy with the smell of dried plants and oils. Amulets and charms were also widely used, straddling the line between superstition and healing. A mother might tie a protective charm around her child's neck, hoping it would ward off the dreaded fevers that could sweep through cramped insulae in the warmer months. Child mortality was heartbreakingly high. Inscriptions show families mourning infants who lived only a few days or weeks. Yet they also reveal a resilience in the face of such loss. Children who survived early years often became crucial contributors to the household economy by adolescence, helping with fieldwork, fetching water, or assisting in workshops. The fragility of youth made survival into adulthood a quiet victory. As Romans aged, they encountered new challenges. Old age, for those who reached it, often meant reliance on family. Since there was no state pension for the average person, sons were expected to provide for elderly parents, and in some households, 3 generations lived under one roof. The elderly were respected in principle, their wisdom valued in family councils, but the burden of care could weigh heavily on poorer households already balancing taxes, rent, and survival. Death itself was a familiar companion. Funerary rituals varied by wealth, but even the humblest families sought to honor their dead with dignity. The poor might share burial clubs, collegia funeratia, pooling resources to ensure a proper send-off. Graves often bore inscriptions written in plain, heartfelt language. She lived 25 years, 2 months, 3 days. These epitaphs are among the most intimate windows we have into ordinary Roman lives, speaking directly across centuries in voices unadorned by politics or power. The rhythms of leisure, though modest, also played a role in easing these burdens. Public baths were a great equalizer, accessible even to the poor for a small fee. Stepping into a bathhouse meant leaving behind the smoke and noise of the streets, entering a space of warmth, steam, and conversation. Men and women bathed separately, but both found in these spaces a rare form of respite. Games, too, were ubiquitous. Children played with nuts as makeshift dice, while adults wagered modest sums on dice games or cheered chariot races from the Circus Maximus, even if their seats were far from the imperial boxes. Food shortages, however, could quickly erase such moments of relief. Grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa supplied Rome itself, but disruption storms, piracy, or political turmoil could send prices soaring. For urban poor, the state's grain dole unknowna was not a luxury but a lifeline, and crowds gathered anxiously on distribution days. Elsewhere, in provincial towns, survival meant constant calculation. How much bread to bake, how much oil to use, whether to sell surplus at market or hold it back against uncertainty. Despite these hardships, there was a remarkable endurance in ordinary Roman life. The empire's splendor, its marble forums, its glittering triumphs was built not only by emperors and generals, but by these millions who lived, labored, and endured without fanfare. Their strength lay not in great victories, but in persistence, in the quiet act of rising each morning to face the demands of another day. To understand the lives of ordinary Romans, one cannot ignore the constant presence of slavery. It was woven into the fabric of the empire in ways both visible and invisible. Slaves worked in kitchens, fields, workshops, and mines, often performing the most grueling and dangerous labor. In wealthy households, they served at the table or as personal attendants, while in rural estates they bent their backs under the sun, harvesting grain or pressing olives for oil. For many free poor citizens, this created a bitter paradox. On one hand, they enjoyed the status of freedom, something a slave could only dream of. On the other, they often competed with enslaved labor for jobs, lowering their wages and limiting their prospects. This tension simmered quietly, occasionally erupting into resentment. Though never strong enough to dismantle a system so central to Rome's economy, slavery was not always permanent. Some enslaved people, especially those who worked closely with their masters, could earn or be granted freedom. These freedmen and freedwomen formed a unique social class, no longer slaves, but not fully equal to the freeborn. They carried the mark of their past in legal and social restrictions, yet many built lives of surprising success. Inscriptions tell of freedmen who became prosperous merchants, bankers, or artisans, using their new status to provide better futures for their children. Still, freedom did not erase vulnerability. Freed families could slip back into poverty, especially during years of famine or heavy taxation. The Roman state's reach was constant, demanding tribute in money, goods, or labor. Tax collectors were rarely forgiving, and failure to pay could mean losing land, property, or standing within the community. For small farmers and laborers, this added a shadow to daily survival. Class distinctions shaped every detail of ordinary existence. Clothing alone signaled status. A simple wool tunic marked a peasant or laborer, while fine-dyed fabrics or togas distinguished the wealthy. Housing, too, reflected hierarchy. The poor in urban Rome lived in cramped insulae, tall tenement-style buildings where fire, collapse, and overcrowding were constant dangers. Meanwhile, the wealthy reclined in spacious villas with mosaics underfoot and courtyards filled with sunlight. Yet even within these grand homes, ordinary servants kept the structure of life functioning. The legal system reinforced these divides. A freeborn citizen could appeal to the courts, while a slave's testimony was considered valid only if extracted under torture. Punishments for crimes varied sharply depending on social status. Theft by a poor man might mean brutal corporal punishment, while the same crime by an elite could be quietly settled with a fine. Justice, like comfort, was a privilege unevenly distributed. Religion, too, reflected both inclusion and exclusion. While temples welcomed worshippers from many walks of life, the elaborate public festivals were funded and led by the wealthy, reinforcing their place at the center of civic life. Ordinary people participated eagerly. Processions, sacrifices, and games offered color and meaning to lives often constrained by hardship, but they also maintained personal household gods, the Lares and Penates, who watched over family and hearth. These private devotions were the most intimate expression of faith, a reminder that survival itself required divine favor. All these elements, slavery, class, law, and religion intertwined to create a world where dignity and struggle coexisted. Ordinary Romans carried the weight of empire on their shoulders, even as they remained largely invisible in its histories. Their resilience lay not in extraordinary deeds, but in enduring a system designed to benefit the few while demanding the labor of the many. Marriage in Rome was rarely about romance for ordinary people. For the poor, it was a practical alliance. Two individuals joining resources to survive. A wife's dowry, even if modest, could make the difference between stability and constant hunger. Marriages were often arranged with an eye on labor, whether a woman could help in the fields, manage a workshop, or raise children who would eventually add to the household's workforce. Women in ordinary Roman families bore an enormous share of responsibility. Beyond raising children, they kept households functioning, grinding grain into flour, weaving fabric for clothing, and storing food to last through difficult seasons. They worked beside men in markets or farms, and in urban neighborhoods, many took on trades such as midwifery, laundry, or small-scale shopkeeping. These contributions, though vital, were rarely celebrated in public records. Children entered the labor force almost as soon as they could walk steadily. Boys might assist their fathers in apprenticeships or farm tasks, while girls learned domestic skills directly from their mothers. Childhood, as we think of it today, was short. Mortality was high, and families understood that every surviving child was both a blessing and an economic necessity. Patriarchy governed household dynamics. Legally, the paterfamilias, the male head of household, held ultimate authority. In theory, he had the power to approve marriages, manage finances, and even decide matters of life and death for his dependents. In practice, the grip of this authority varied. In poorer households, cooperation often mattered more than rigid hierarchy. A wife who could stretch food supplies or negotiate fairly at market had power that was practical, even if not legally recognized. Rituals around birth and family life reveal much about ordinary survival. At childbirth, offerings were made to protect both mother and infant, since the risks were immense. Small charms or amulets were tied around a baby's neck to ward off evil, on the 9th day after birth for boys, and the 8th for girls. Families held a naming ceremony simple for the poor, elaborate for the wealthy. These small acts tied families into a cycle of tradition, strengthening bonds during an existence marked by uncertainty. Family honor, even among the poor, mattered deeply. Gossip in small communities could shape reputations, affect marriage prospects, or even lead to disputes. Women were expected to preserve chastity before marriage and fidelity after, though double standards allowed men greater freedoms. When conflicts arose, they were settled as much by community judgment as by law. Festivals offered some respite. During Saturnalia, a winter celebration, ordinary households relaxed strict hierarchies. Children received small gifts, families shared better meals than usual, and even slaves were allowed brief moments of leisure. These rare intervals of joy reminded Romans of what life could be when daily burdens were momentarily lifted. Through marriage, children, and ritual, the structure of Roman society reproduced itself generation after generation. Ordinary people had little chance of changing the wider system, but they carved spaces of meaning in their households and neighborhoods. It was in these intimate circles, round shared bread, whispered prayers, and the laughter of children, that Roman life's resilience truly lay. For ordinary Romans, health was a constant concern. Without the benefits of modern medicine, even minor ailments could become life-threatening. In poor districts of Rome, or in small villages, people relied less on trained physicians, who were expensive, and more on a mix of home remedies, community wisdom, and religious practices. The kitchen doubled as an apothecary. Garlic was believed to strengthen the body, honey to heal wounds, and vinegar to purify water or soothe a sore throat. Herbs such as rue, fennel, and mint were grown in small gardens or gathered in the countryside, then brewed into teas or poultices. Mothers often inherited recipes for remedies from their own mothers, ensuring that practical knowledge was passed down through generations. Superstition played a central role in healing. Amulets engraved with protective symbols were worn to ward off fevers or evil spirits believed to cause illness. A common charm was the fascinum, a small carved object thought to deflect harm. Families often whispered prayers to household gods, the Lares and Pinites, asking them to guard health and protect food stores from spoiling. Disease was never far away. In cramped urban tenements, poor sanitation meant outbreaks of dysentery, lice, and fevers spread quickly. Farmers, though surrounded by open air, faced their own risks: infections from injuries, malnutrition in lean years, or seasonal illnesses tied to cold winters and hot summers. Infant mortality remained heartbreakingly common, and many mothers gave birth knowing that not all their children would survive. Professional physicians existed, but their reputation was mixed. Many were Greek migrants, some genuinely skilled, others charlatans. For the wealthy, a private physician could be kept on staff, but ordinary people might encounter one only rarely, often in emergencies. Treatments could be brutal bleeding, cupping, or doses of strong purgatives. When these failed, prayer or resignation often followed. Bathhouses, accessible even to the poor for a small fee, played a surprising role in health. Beyond washing, baths were thought to restore balance to the body. Hot rooms opened pores, cold plunges refreshed muscles, and massages with oil soothed aches. For many, these public baths were not just luxuries, but a form of preventive medicine. Mental health, though not understood as we define it today, was also addressed in symbolic ways. Nightmares, melancholy, or sudden rages were attributed to the gods' displeasure or to curses. Families sometimes sought out soothsayers or healers who used chants, smoke, or ritual cleansing to restore peace to a troubled spirit. What stands out is how health, spirituality, and daily routine were intertwined. Ordinary Romans saw the body not as separate from the divine, but as vulnerable to both earthly and supernatural forces. By blending herbs, rituals, and prayers, they tried to tip the balance of survival ever so slightly in their favor. While Roman markets brimmed with goods in times of prosperity, ordinary people often lived one poor harvest away from hunger. Grain was the lifeblood of the empire, and for the working poor, bread made up the largest share of daily calories. Yet grain supplies were vulnerable to drought, war, or disrupted trade routes. In the capital, this danger was so acute that emperors introduced the annona, the grain dole, distributing free or subsidized grain to citizens to prevent riots. In the countryside, families depended on their own harvests. To safeguard against scarcity, peasants stored grain in clay jars, underground pits, or wooden bins lined with pitch to keep pests at bay. Salted meats, dried figs, smoked fish, and olive oil were tucked away to extend supplies. Even with these precautions, a poor harvest could leave households dangerously thin on food before the next year's planting. In years of plenty, markets bustled with abundance. Lentils, chickpeas, onions, and cabbages sold cheaply, while grapes and olives filled baskets. But in lean years, even humble ingredients grew costly. Urban workers sometimes diluted their flour with bran, or ground acorns into meal to stretch their bread. Wealthier households, able to afford imported delicacies, carried on almost untouched an inequality that ordinary Romans could not fail to notice. Scarcity shaped social rhythms. Families rationed meals carefully, eating 2 small portions a day instead of 3. Soups became thinner, loaves smaller. Children might be given priority, while adults filled their bellies with watery gruel to ward off hunger pangs. Hunger also drove innovation. Mushrooms foraged from the wild, chestnuts roasted over small fires, or bitter greens plucked from the roadside became staples when cupboards ran bare. Communal support sometimes softened the blow. Neighbors shared surplus when they could, while extended families pooled resources. Rural villages often relied on reciprocal lending of grain or oil, with the expectation that debts would be repaid after the next harvest. These systems of trust helped communities survive cycles of want, but in the hardest times, droughts, crop blights, or disruptions caused by military campaigns, famine struck. Desperation could drive people to barter their possessions, sell animals, or even fall into debt bondage. Ancient authors recorded that famine led to unrest in cities, forcing authorities to scramble for imports from North Africa, Sicily, or Egypt. For ordinary people, survival depended less on resilience alone and more on whether supply lines held. Despite these hardships, cultural traditions reminded Romans to endure. Festivals such as Saturnalia, even in lean years, encouraged generosity, feasting, and shared laughter. Though food might be scarce, The rituals of community and the promise of better seasons ahead helped people survive the darkest months. For ordinary Romans, survival was not only about food, but also about what they wore and where they lived. Clothing was simple, functional, and dictated by class and occupation. The basic garment was the tunica, a simple woolen tunic that reached to the knees for men and to the ankles for women. For most, wool was coarse and itchy, spun from local sheep, and dyed in muted browns or grays. Only wealthier households could afford softer fabrics, bright dyes, or imported linens. Sandals, made from leather straps, were worn by both men and women, though many peasants in rural villages went barefoot to save wear on precious footwear. Cloaks were essential during cold weather. The heavy pianula, a hooded wool cloak, shielded farmers and laborers from rain and wind, while the lighter sagum was favored by soldiers and outdoor workers. Clothing was patched and repatched until threadbare, as textiles were costly and every scrap of fabric held value. Shelter for ordinary families varied between city and countryside. In Rome itself, the majority of people lived in insulate apartment blocks of multiple stories, built quickly and often cheaply. The lower floors were more desirable, offering sturdier construction and access to water, while the upper floors were cramped, dark, and reached by rickety wooden staircases. Fires and collapses were common hazards, making urban housing precarious. In rural areas, farmers and peasants lived in modest single-room cottages built from mud brick, stone, or timber, depending on local materials. Roofs were typically thatched with straw or covered with tiles if the family could afford them. Inside, the central space was sparse, a hearth for cooking, a few clay pots, wooden stools, and straw mats for sleeping. Privacy was nearly non-existent, as whole families and sometimes animals shared the same space. The atmosphere of these dwellings was a mix of necessity and hardship. Smoke from the hearth clung to walls, leaving ceilings blackened with soot. Floors were packed earth, uneven and dusty in summer, muddy in winter. Insects and rodents were frequent companions, and families relied on cats, dogs, or simple traps to keep them at bay. Yet, even in these humble conditions, small efforts at comfort could be found. Perhaps a sprig of herbs hung to freshen the air, a crude mosaic laid by a skilled relative, or a painted charm to ward off ill fortune. Urban neighborhoods were noisy and chaotic. The clatter of carts, the cries of vendors, and the shouting of children filled narrow alleys. Rural villages, by contrast, followed the rhythms of the seasons quieter, but with the distant sounds of animals, wind, and field labor forming the background of daily life. For ordinary Romans, these environments defined existence: the rough texture of wool against skin, the uneven floor beneath bare feet, the constant awareness of fragile housing, and the communal closeness of life lived without privacy. Such details, often ignored in grand histories, were the fabric of survival in the empire. Hygiene in daily Roman life was shaped by both practicality and ritual. In cities, the most striking feature was the network of public baths, while the grand thermae built by emperors dazzled with marble halls and mosaics. Ordinary citizens more often relied on smaller local baths tucked into neighborhoods. For a modest fee, they could enjoy a sequence of heated rooms, plunges into hot or cold water, and the chance to scrape their skin clean with a strigula curved metal tool used to remove oil, sweat, and dust. Soap, as we know it today, was rare. Instead, olive oil mixed with herbs often served to cleanse and soften the skin. For those too poor to visit the baths, hygiene was far simpler. A basin of cold water, fetched from a fountain or a stream in rural areas, was often the extent of washing. Faces, hands, and feet were cleaned daily, but full body washing was less frequent, especially in winter months. Children might be bathed together in the same tub to save water and firewood for heating. Toilets were another marker of Roman urban life. Large communal latrines with rows of stone seats were common in cities, often connected to flowing water systems. Wealthier households had private facilities, but the poor depended on these shared spaces, where conversation and gossip flowed as freely as the water channels beneath. In rural huts, however, waste was managed with simple pits or chamber pots, emptied into the fields as fertilizer. Water itself was both a blessing and a challenge. The aqueducts that carried water into cities were marvels of engineering, feeding fountains, baths, and cisterns. Public fountains dotted Roman streets, allowing citizens to collect fresh water daily in clay jars or wooden buckets. In crowded districts, waiting in line at a fountain was part of daily routine. In contrast, rural families often relied on wells, streams, or collected rainwater, sometimes walking long distances to fetch enough for household needs. Health was precarious, with even small ailments carrying serious risks. Common colds, fevers, or infected cuts could easily turn deadly in a world without antibiotics. Herbal remedies were the first line of treatment: infusions of fennel for digestion, willow bark for pain, or garlic as a general tonic. Village healers, midwives, and wise women often carried as much authority as formally trained physicians, since their knowledge was rooted in generations of practical experience. Diseases spread quickly in dense cities. The close quarters of the insulae, combined with poor sanitation and pests, meant outbreaks of fevers and stomach illnesses were frequent. Children were especially vulnerable, and infant mortality remained high even in prosperous households. In the countryside, fewer people meant less contagion, but hardships like malnutrition, injuries from farm labor, and exposure to the elements were constant threats. And yet, Romans displayed remarkable resilience. Amulets and charms were worn to ward off illness. Prayers were offered to household gods like the Lares and Penates, and festivals included rituals for health and purification. Survival was never taken for granted. It was earned each day through careful habits, community support, and faith in both practical and divine protection. Work defined the rhythm of ordinary Roman life as much as food and family did. For most, the day began not with leisure, but with labor that was physically demanding and unending. Farmers, who made up the vast majority of the population, rose at dawn to begin tasks dictated by the season. Spring meant sowing grains, planting vineyards, and tending young olive trees. Summer demanded irrigation, weeding, and the care of animals. Autumn brought the harvest of grapes and olives, followed by the pressing of oil and wine. Winter was devoted to mending tools, repairing roofs, and preparing fields for the next year. Smallholders often worked their own land with the help of family members, but larger estates, especially those near Rome, depended heavily on slave labor. Enslaved workers could be found in fields from dawn to dusk, plowing, reaping, or carrying water, always under the watch of overseers. The difference between free and enslaved laborers was sharp, yet both endured the same sun, mud, and back-breaking strain. In cities, artisans filled the streets with the sounds of their trades. Blacksmiths hammered iron into nails, tools, and weapon parts. Potters shaped clay into amphorae for wine and oil, their kilns glowing late into the night. Bakers rose long before dawn to knead dough and fire bread for the morning crowds, while cobblers stitched sandals that would carry soldiers, merchants, and slaves across the empire's vast roads. Shops were often small and narrow, open to the street, where craftsmen sold their wares directly to neighbors and passers-by. Merchants thrived in the bustle of the markets. At the forum and towns, stalls overflowed with goods: honey, dried figs, smoked fish, woven cloth, and cheap pottery for everyday use. Traders shouted prices, weighed produce, and struck deals, often amid the chatter of gossip and the cries of animals. For many, these markets were not only about buying food, but about exchanging news, finding day labor, or simply watching the colorful swirl of people from different regions. Soldiers, though fewer in number compared to farmers and artisans, represented a different kind of working life. A career in the legions meant discipline, training, and constant readiness. Ordinary citizens who joined found themselves drilling, building roads and forts, or standing guard far from their homes. Pay was steady, meals were reliable, and service promised rewards, land, or pensions at the end of decades of duty. Yet for the common soldier, the daily grind often meant more shovels than swords. With much of their time devoted to construction and maintenance rather than battle. Slaves performed countless invisible tasks that sustained Roman households. In wealthy homes, some worked as cooks, cleaners, or tutors, while others tended fires, fetched water, or ground grain. In more modest homes, a single slave might handle many duties, from caring for children to mending clothes. Freedmen, former slaves who had earned or been granted their freedom, often continued in trades similar to those they had once performed in bondage, forming a vital layer of the urban workforce. Despite the grind, there was pride in skill and labor. Artisans signed their pottery, soldiers carved their names into walls of forts, and farmers inscribed dedications to gods thanking them for a good harvest. Even the smallest tasks, mending a net, sharpening a plow, or stacking amphorae, were part of a great network of human effort that fed, clothed, and armed the Roman world. As the Roman day advanced and the sun climbed higher, the constant hum of labor filled both countryside and city. From distant fields came the steady rhythm of scythes cutting through stalks, while in towns the ringing of hammers, the clatter of carts, and the cries of merchants echoed down narrow streets. For most ordinary Romans, life was never free from the demands of work, yet it was work that defined them, gave shape to their days, and tied them into the immense web of the empire. Still, no matter how demanding, there was always a pause and interlude between toil and the setting of the sun. Farmers might sit under the shade of an olive tree, with a loaf of coarse bread and a jug of watered wine. Artisans, their hands still marked with clay or soot, would step outside their workshops to breathe the warm air. Even slaves, when their tasks briefly ended, stole moments of quiet, leaning against a doorway, closing their eyes, and listening to the world around them. These pauses remind us that ordinary Romans did not live only through work, but also through survival strategies, through customs that helped them endure, and through the small pleasures that softened hardship. As twilight approached, families gathered, whether in a peasant's hut or a modest city apartment, to share meals, to talk, to argue, and to laugh. In these moments, the beating heart of Roman life becomes visible not in marble monuments or military victories, but in the fragile routines that held communities together. It is here, in the gap between labor and rest, that we begin to see the deeper truths of survival in the Roman world. Beyond the farms and markets lay social rhythms that bound people into hierarchies, obligations, and unspoken struggles. Daily life was not only about plowing fields or selling goods, it was also about navigating the strict expectations of Roman society, about enduring poverty, and about finding ways to resist or adapt to the structures of power. And so, as we close this first section, we leave behind the clamor of work and the sights of markets and fields. In Section 2, we step further inside the lives of ordinary Romans, not just what they ate or how they labored, but how they endured their place within the vast machinery of empire. Here, we uncover the hidden burdens, the quiet strategies of survival, and the startling realities of life that are often forgotten in grand histories of emperors and conquests. When we imagine the Roman Empire, it is easy to picture triumphal arches, glittering mosaics, or senators in white togas. Yet for the overwhelming majority of people, daily life was neither glamorous nor easy. Beneath the polished surface of Roman culture lay a harsher reality, one where inequality was vast, survival precarious, and even the simplest comforts came at a price. For many, the most immediate struggle was housing. In the great cities of the empire, especially Rome itself. Thousands lived crammed into towering insulae apartment blocks, hastily built of wood, brick, and cheap mortar. These structures leaned precariously, with upper floors swaying in the wind. Fires were a constant danger, and whole neighborhoods could collapse without warning. The poor often occupied the upper levels, where the staircases were steep and water had to be carried up by hand. The wealthy, by contrast, secured the safer ground floor rooms, with more stable walls and easier access to wells. Inside these insulae, privacy barely existed. Families squeezed into a single dark chamber, where smoke from oil lamps and cooking fires clung to the air. Walls were thin, sounds traveled easily, and quarrels between neighbors could erupt over the smallest disturbance. Rats and insects thrived in the damp corners, while sewage sometimes overflowed from the streets below. For the poor of Rome, the splendor of the Colosseum or the marble baths was little more than a distant sight, enjoyed only when work or errands took them past. But hardship was not confined to the city. In the countryside, tenant farmers' colonia fund worked land they did not own, bound by contracts that kept them perpetually indebted to landlords. Many were forced to surrender a large portion of their harvest, leaving their families with only enough grain or vegetables to scrape through the year. Bad weather or a failed crop could mean hunger, and hunger meant vulnerability to disease. While some wealthier landowners dined on imported spices, honey, and wine, their laborers survived on bread made from barley or millet grains, considered so coarse that Roman elites called them food for animals. And then there were slaves, the silent backbone of the empire. Enslaved men, women, and even children were everywhere, in households, in fields, in mines, and on ships. Their lives were often brutally short. A household slave might find relative stability if a master was merciful. But field laborers and mine workers endured punishing conditions that destroyed bodies within years. Roman law allowed masters to punish slaves severely, even kill them, with little consequence. Yet, despite this cruelty, slaves developed quiet forms of resistance, working slowly, breaking tools, or clinging to cultural traditions that reminded them of freedom. What is most striking about these realities is how they coexisted with Rome's grandeur. The same society that built aqueducts to carry clean water into cities left its poorest citizens hauling buckets up rickety staircases. The same culture that staged elaborate feasts and gladiatorial shows relied on the invisible suffering of those who labored without choice. To live as an ordinary person in Rome was to live in the shadow of empire, always close enough to see its magnificence, yet rarely able to touch it. One of the most unsettling truths about life in the Roman Empire was the sheer prevalence of disease. Ancient Roman cities were crowded, poorly ventilated, and overflowing with waste. Streets were often slick with animal droppings from the carts and herds that passed daily, while open drains carried sewage only part of the way before overflowing into alleys. In hot summers, the stench became overwhelming. Without modern knowledge of germs, Romans blamed bad air or the wrath of the gods for outbreaks, but epidemics were common. Malaria was endemic in the marshy regions near Rome. Dysentery spread easily in crowded quarters, and even the famed public baths could become breeding grounds for skin infections and parasites. These baths, often celebrated as a hallmark of Roman civilization, carried their own hidden dangers. While they were centers of social life, places where gossip flowed as freely as warm water, hygiene was far from ideal. Pools were rarely drained, and hundreds of bathers could pass through in a single day. Shared sponges were used in toilets instead of paper, rinsed only in salty water, and infections spread from person to person with ease. For the elite, the baths symbolized refinement, but for the poor, they could be a place where illness lingered unseen. Crime also shadowed everyday existence. Roman streets, especially after dark, could be treacherous. Torchlight was scarce, and narrow alleys created perfect hiding spots for thieves. Muggings were so common that wealthy citizens often traveled with armed slaves or bodyguards. Pickpockets thrived in marketplaces, slipping through crowds while vendors shouted prices. Even inside insulae, theft was frequent. Neighbors, sometimes stealing food, firewood, or clothing when desperation outweighed trust. Roman law was harsh and punishments brutal, but enforcement was uneven, and the poor often suffered most. The dangers extended to work as well. Ordinary jobs were frequently hazardous and short-lived. Dockworkers on the Tiber River risked drowning when overloaded barges capsized. Miners descended into shafts filled with toxic dust and fumes, their lungs giving out long before old age. Bakers labored beside ovens, so hot that burns and heatstroke were constant risks. Even simple street trades carried dangers. Roof tilers and plasterers fell from heights, while butchers and tanners handled sharp knives and animal hides soaked in foul-smelling chemicals. For many, survival meant accepting daily exposure to risks that few modern people would willingly endure. And then there was hunger. While Rome's emperors boasted of feeding the masses through the grain dole, it was never enough to provide security for all. If shipments from Egypt or North Africa were delayed by storms or piracy, panic spread quickly. Grain prices soared, bread became scarce, and riots erupted. People scrambled for scraps, while the wealthy could still afford imported delicacies. For those on the edge of poverty, every meal was uncertain, and famine was never more than a bad harvest away. These truths remind us that beneath the cultural achievements of Rome, its poetry, philosophy, and monuments, millions lived lives of constant precarity. For them, the empire was not a golden age, but a fragile balance between survival and disaster. Punishment in the Roman world was often public, brutal, and designed to instill fear. For minor thefts, beatings and branding were common. Repeat offenders could lose a hand. Slaves endured far worse. If a master was murdered, the law allowed every slave in the household to be executed, regardless of guilt, on the belief that loyalty should have prevented the crime. Crucifixion, perhaps the most infamous Roman penalty, was not reserved for rare cases, but a visible reality. Along roads leading into cities, travelers might pass rows of crucified bodies, a grim reminder of what awaited rebels and criminals alike. The message was clear. Obedience was survival. Even the famed Colosseum and arenas, symbols of Roman grandeur, carried hidden costs. For ordinary people, games offered distraction from hardship, but they were built on suffering. Gladiators, often slaves or condemned men, fought not for glory, but because they had no choice. Animal hunts filled the arena floor with exotic beasts, lions, elephants, bears brought from across the empire, and their slaughter was staged for entertainment. Behind the spectacle was an enormous machinery of death, financed to keep the population entertained and distracted from political unrest. For citizens in the cheap seats, it was thrilling, but for those forced to participate, it was terror. Religion also played a complicated role. On the surface, rituals and festivals were joyous occasions, filling the calendar with feasts, sacrifices, and processions. But religion was also a tool of social control. Omens and augury, the reading of animal entrails or bird flights, were used to justify decisions by the elite, leaving ordinary people with little say in matters that shaped their lives. Refusing to honor the gods or neglecting the rituals could mean social isolation, suspicion, or worse. Later, as Christianity spread, persecution became a reality for converts, forcing them into secrecy and constant fear. Psychologically, the weight of empire pressed down on common lives. Taxes were a constant burden, demanded in grain, labor, or coin, and tax collectors had reputations for corruption. Military drafts pulled young men away from their homes, sometimes never to return. For conquered peoples, Roman rule often meant living with the humiliation of being second class, forced to adopt Roman customs while still viewed as outsiders. Anxiety about war, famine, or plague was never far away. For all its glory, Rome's empire was a system that relied on control, spectacle, and fear. Ordinary men and women lived not just with hardship, but also under the shadow of an empire that could both feed them and crush them without warning. The image of Rome as a city of marble was only partly true. Ordinary people were far more likely to live in insular multi-story apartment blocks of wood and brick. These buildings were crowded, unstable, and often dangerous. The wealthiest families lived on the lower floors, with thicker walls and easier access to water. The poorest were crammed into dark upper levels, where ceilings were low, rooms tiny, and staircases steep. Fires were constant threats, sparked by oil lamps, cooking braziers, or the wooden beams themselves. When one block went up in flames, entire neighborhoods could vanish overnight. Flooding was another hazard. Lower rooms often swamped by overflowing drains or sewers, leaving foul water and disease in their wake. Contrast this with the luxury villas of the elite. Behind high walls, the wealthy lived with heated floors, private baths, fountains, and mosaics underfoot. The inequality was so visible that a stroll through the city could mean passing from stinking tenements into courtyards lined with marble columns within a few steps. Ordinary citizens were constantly reminded of their position in the social hierarchy, their lives unfolding in the shadows of palaces and temples they could never enter. Daily survival also depended heavily on slaves, whose presence shaped nearly every corner of Roman life. Slaves were not just in fields or workshops. They were in kitchens, carrying water, raising children, and even running businesses on behalf of their masters. Some slaves were educated Greeks, teaching the children of the elite, while others toiled in mines under brutal conditions where life expectancy was measured in months. For ordinary free citizens, the presence of slaves was both a relief and a source of tension. Many depended on slave labor to keep food flowing into the city and services functioning. Yet they also feared slave revolts, like the uprising led by Spartacus, which showed just how fragile the balance of control could be. The city itself was noisy, alive with smells and sounds that reflected these divisions. Street vendors shouted prices. Bakers worked before dawn. Sewage ran through open gutters. Yet alongside this energy, there was always danger. Collapse of an insula, spread of disease in cramped quarters, or sudden riots could transform daily life into chaos. For ordinary people, Rome was both opportunity and risk, a place where survival required resilience in the face of instability. Food was always at the heart of survival in the Roman Empire, and though the unknown, the grain, fed many, supply could never be fully trusted. Grain had to be shipped from North Africa and Egypt, across treacherous seas. Storms, piracy, or political disputes could delay shipments, leaving thousands anxious about whether the daily bread ration would arrive. Bakers, dependent on this imported grain, sometimes watered down flour or mixed in husks to stretch supplies. For the poor, whose diets already leaned heavily on bread and porridge, shortages meant real hunger. Meat was rare, fish expensive, and fresh vegetables unreliable. Malnutrition was common among children, even in the heart of Rome, masked only by the bustling markets that seemed abundant on the surface. On the streets, danger lurked once night fell. Rome did not have a professional police force in the way we understand today. Instead, small watch groups and night patrols tried to keep order, but robberies, muggings, and assaults were frequent. Poorly lit alleyways became hunting grounds for thieves, and drunken brawls were common near taverns and brothels. Even the wealthier citizens, carried in litters by slaves, were not always safe from gangs who attacked for money or revenge. For the common laborer heading home after a long day, clutching a loaf of bread or a small jug of wine, the darkness of the streets carried constant unease. Layered over this daily insecurity was the fear of disease. Rome's population density was staggering. Insulae packed families in on top of each other, Waste disposal was rudimentary, and water systems, though advanced, were not immune to contamination. Outbreaks of fevers, stomach illnesses, and mysterious plagues swept through the city with little warning. Doctors existed, but their remedies, herbs, bloodletting, or charms were often ineffective. The average Roman lived with the knowledge that sudden illness could take a family member overnight, with little hope of cure. For many, survival was less about comfort and more about navigating this constant, invisible fragility. And yet, despite hunger, crime, and sickness, life went on. Markets reopened each morning, laughter spilled from taverns, and families clung to rituals and routines that gave shape to their days. Ordinary Romans learned to live with uncertainty, balancing fear with resilience, their lives unfolding between hardship and small joys that kept them pressing forward. In a city where survival was uncertain, religion was not a choice, it was a necessity. Ordinary Romans lived in a world they believed was governed by dozens of gods, spirits, and unseen forces, each requiring careful attention. At the doorway of nearly every home, you would find small shrines to the household gods, the lares and pin. Offerings of breadcrumbs, wine, or a few drops of oil were made daily, not as grand gestures, but as quiet acts of protection. Families feared that neglecting these rituals could bring misfortune, illness, or even the collapse of their household. Beyond the home, public festivals punctuated the year with moments of relief. The Saturnalia, for instance, was one of the most anticipated times, lasting several days. It turned the normal social order upside down. Masters served their slaves. Gifts were exchanged, and laughter filled the streets. For ordinary people, it was a rare escape from rigid hierarchies and constant struggle, a moment when joy and mischief were allowed to flourish openly. There were also religious processions that wound through the city, filling streets with music, incense, and color. For the poor, these spectacles offered not just entertainment but a sense of belonging to something larger. A baker might work endlessly in his cramped shop, but on festival days, he could step outside and feel part of Rome itself, vast, powerful, and eternal. But religion was not only about celebration. In times of plague, drought, or military defeat, fear drove entire communities to the temples, where sacrifices were offered to gods believed to hold Rome's fate. Ordinary people watched anxiously as priests examined animal entrails, searching for signs of divine approval or wrath. The unpredictability of disasters made Romans cling even more tightly to these rituals, because to neglect them felt like inviting doom. Yet, not all faith was directed at Rome's traditional gods. Mystery cults like those of Isis from Egypt or Mithras from Persia spread among soldiers, traders, and laborers. These cults promised personal salvation, secret knowledge, or life after death, things the old Roman religion never offered. For the average person living in hardship, these new faiths held a powerful appeal. To join was to hope that their suffering might carry deeper meaning, or that life did not simply end in silence. For ordinary Romans, religion was never abstract theology. It was woven into their survival, their small joys, their fears, and their hope that tomorrow would be more bearable than today. If daily life was harsh, entertainment was the remedy. Rome understood that the people needed bread, but they also needed spectacles. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was more than political rhetoric. It was a lived reality for the city's poor. The most famous entertainments were, of course, the gladiatorial games. For ordinary Romans, these events were more than violent sport. They were theater, ritual, and release. A laborer who spent his week carrying bricks or sweeping the forum could suddenly find himself among tens of thousands in the Colosseum, swept up in the roar of the crowd. The arena gave the illusion that even the humblest spectators shared in Rome's grandeur, part of a people who commanded life and death with a mere shout of approval or disapproval. Chariot racing held equal, if not greater, sway. The Circus Maximus could seat hundreds of thousands, and the rivalries between factions, the Reds, Blues, Greens, and Whites ran as deep as modern sports rivalries. Ordinary Romans pledged fierce loyalty to their chosen team, wearing colors, shouting chants, and even rioting when outcomes displeased them. For a day, their lives were not measured in debts or empty grain jars, but in the pounding hooves of horses and the cheers of their neighbors. Theater, too, was part of this fabric of distraction. Comic plays often mocking politicians, wealthy elites, or meddling wives allowed ordinary people to laugh at the very structures that oppressed them. Even if just for an afternoon, humor served as rebellion, and laughter became a form of survival. Not all diversions required massive arenas. Taverns and small gaming houses provided everyday escapes. Dice games, board games, and drinking contests filled dimly lit rooms where men argued, gossiped, and forgot their troubles. These spaces were rowdy, often dangerous, but also essential gathering places where friendships formed and petty rivalries played out. For the poorest Romans, simple pleasures were enough. Listening to a street musician, watching acrobats or jugglers in the forum, or joining in noisy celebrations during feast days. The city itself was a stage, and every corner offered some fragment of spectacle. Entertainment did not erase the burdens of life, but it dulled them. Ordinary people who might otherwise despair found in these diversions something precious, a sense that they, too, were part of the Roman story, not just as laborers or beggars, but as spectators and participants in the rhythms of the empire. Life in Rome was not lived only in forums, markets, or arenas. Much of it unfolded in the cramped, dimly lit interiors of insolent apartment buildings where the majority of ordinary people resided. These structures, rising several stories high, were notorious for their fragility. Built quickly and cheaply, with wooden beams and weak brickwork, they were prone to fire and collapse. To live in an insula was to live with constant uncertainty. Most families rented a single room, perhaps two, if fortune allowed. These spaces were bare walls of plaster, floors of packed dirt or uneven tiles, and few possessions beyond a low table, sleeping mats, and clay lamps. Privacy was rare. Parents, children, and sometimes elderly relatives shared the same cramped space. The rhythms of daily life playing out under one roof with little separation. For many, the street itself became an extension of the home. Meals cooked in doorways, conversations shouted from windows, and children playing in alleys until darkness fell. Water posed a daily struggle. While aqueducts supplied Rome with impressive fountains and public baths, few ordinary apartments had private access. Women and slaves carried water up steep staircases in clay jars, balancing them carefully as they climbed. Waste disposal was even more precarious. Chamber pots were often emptied into the street below, filling alleys with smells that mingled with smoke from cooking fires. The grandeur of Rome's monuments stood in stark contrast to the squalor in which most citizens lived. Family life within these homes was both fragile and resilient. Fathers legally, the heads of households were often absent for long hours of work, while mothers managed the domestic sphere, stretching meager supplies of grain, olives, and lentils into meals. Children contributed early, helping with chores or apprenticeships, their play interwoven with the skills of survival. Despite hardship, there were moments of tenderness. Simple rituals marked the days, sharing bread at dawn, telling stories by lamplight, or honoring household gods with offerings at tiny shrines set into walls. These shrines, called laurea, were often the most cherished feature of an otherwise bare home. Painted with bright colors or adorned with small figurines, they connected families to ancestors and spirits of protection, a reminder that even the humblest household was bound to something larger and sacred. The dangers of insula life were never far away. Fires, sparked by cooking braziers or oil lamps, could sweep through entire blocks. Collapses claimed lives suddenly, crushing families in their sleep. Yet rebuilding always followed, and families returned to the same precarious structures, for there was no other choice. Housing was a cycle of endurance, much like the rest of Roman life, fragile, uncertain, but always continuing, for the ordinary people of Rome. The home was not a sanctuary in the modern sense, it was a place of survival, a fragile shelter that held within it both the weight of hardship and the warmth of shared existence. For the average Roman, faith was not confined to grand temples or priestly ceremonies. It seeped into the texture of everyday life, shaping how people cooked, worked, traveled, and even slept. Ordinary men and women lived surrounded by unseen forces, spirits of the home, the street, the crossroads, and even the door hinges. These presences demanded constant attention, for neglect was thought to bring misfortune. Inside humble apartments, Lares and Penates' household gods were honored at small altars set into plaster walls. A family might offer a crust of bread, a splash of wine, or a few drops of oil before meals, whispering thanks for protection. Such offerings were not elaborate, but they carried deep meaning. In a world where fire, famine, or disease could strike without warning, these little gestures were a way of asking for stability in unstable lives. Superstitions were equally embedded in daily rhythms. A sneeze was not merely a bodily reflex, but a sign from the gods, often acknowledged with a quick exclamation. Black dogs or crows, crossing one's path, could unsettle even the most rational mind, and charms carved from bone or bronze were worn to keep away the evil eye. Midwives tied protective amulets around newborns, believing these would ward off illness or the jealousy of neighbors. Public festivals brought rare moments of communal joy. Even the poorest Romans could join in the Saturnalia, when masters and slaves traded roles, or the Lupercalia, where processions filled the streets with noise and laughter. These events blurred social divisions, reminding people that beneath Rome's rigid hierarchies, all shared the same cycles of fear, hope, and renewal. Death, too, was surrounded by ritual. Funerals were noisy, crowded affairs, but for the poor, they could be heartbreakingly modest. Still, even the simplest burial included tokens, a coin placed in the mouth of the deceased as payment to Corin, the ferryman of the underworld. To skip this rite was unthinkable. It meant condemning a loved one to wander restlessly on the shores of the afterlife. Religion for ordinary Romans was less about theology and more about practice. Few could recite the lofty philosophies of Cicero or Seneca, but all understood the importance of honoring the unseen. In a fragile world, where sudden death and disaster were always near, belief offered a fragile but essential anchor. For these people, faith was not abstract, it was survival, woven into every loaf of bread shared, every amulet worn, and every whispered prayer before sleep. Illness was one of the greatest fears in Roman daily life, and for ordinary people, it hovered like an ever-present shadow. The poor could not afford the services of trained physicians, many of whom charged fees beyond the reach of laborers or market vendors. Instead, they turned to traditional remedies, village healers, and a blend of practical knowledge and superstition passed down through generations. Herbal medicine formed the backbone of treatment. Simple plants such as garlic, fennel, and rue were believed to cure a surprising range of ailments, from fevers to stomach aches. Honey, valued for its soothing qualities, was applied to wounds to stave off infection. Olive oil was rubbed into sore joints and muscles, while wine was prescribed as both disinfectant and medicine for internal pain. These remedies were often effective enough to offer comfort, though they rarely cured serious disease. Charms and incantations also played a central role. A mother might whisper a protective chant over a child suffering from cough, while an elderly neighbor suggested tying certain herbs to the wrist as a ward against fever. For the Romans, the line between medicine and magic was thin, and both were pursued with equal seriousness. To ignore either was to risk worsening the illness. Public health conditions often worked against recovery. In crowded tenements, with poor ventilation and open drains running through alleys, disease spread quickly. Epidemics, whether of malaria, dysentery, or plague, could sweep entire districts, leaving families devastated. For the poorest citizens, there was little defense but resilience. They relied on family networks to care for the sick and communal rituals to give meaning to loss. Bathhouses, however, provided one rare and accessible form of preventive care. Even the humble could visit smaller, local baths, where warm water, steam, and massage were available at a low cost. Romans believed that bathing purified the body and soul alike, washing away not only dirt, but also the dangers of imbalance and corruption within. For many, the bathhouse served as both clinic and refuge, offering relief from pain and the heavy burdens of life. When death came, as it often did, suddenly and without mercy, the community responded with families pooled resources for modest burials, and burial clubs, formed among workers and neighbors, ensured that even the poorest were not left unremembered. Illness may have claimed bodies, but memory and ritual preserved dignity. Thus, the health practices of ordinary Romans reveal a world where survival depended not on advanced science, but on resilience, shared wisdom, and the enduring hope that the gods, or perhaps a humble herb, might grant one more day of life. For ordinary Romans, clothing was never just fabric against the skin. It was a silent statement of status, respectability, and identity. While senators displayed their purple-edged togas, and wealthy matrons draped themselves in fine silks imported from the East, the average citizen lived in far humbler attire. The tunica, a simple woolen garment resembling a long shirt, was the everyday uniform of Rome's common people. Men wore it belted at the waist, falling to the knees for laborers who needed freedom of movement, or longer for those in modest offices or trades. Women's tunics stretched to the ankles, often layered with a stola if they could afford the extra cloth. The stola, though plain compared to elite fashions, marked respectability and modesty in a world where appearances shaped reputation. Wool was the most common fabric, itchy in summer, heavy in winter, but durable enough for hard use. In regions of the empire where the climate was warmer, lighter linen was sometimes worn, though it cost more. Only the prosperous could indulge in silk or dyed fabrics of brilliant hues, while the masses wore muted tones of undyed wool, whites, browns, and grays, sometimes patched many times over. Footwear varied by occupation. The sturdy calceus, a closed shoe, was worn in towns and for official appearances, while workers often preferred sandals or even went barefoot, especially in the heat. Soldiers, by contrast, had their hobnailed boots, designed for marching long miles across uneven terrain, styles sometimes imitated by civilians who admired their practicality. Clothing also had its ritual moments. On market days or during festivals, families might wear their best tunic, even if best simply meant one without holes or stains. A mother might carefully launder and beat a garment clean on a stone by the river, ensuring her children looked presentable before the gods and their neighbors. In this way, clothing was not only about warmth or covering but also about dignity, the small pride of showing oneself respectably in the public eye. Jewelry, when it appeared, was usually modest. A bronze brooch, a simple iron ring, or perhaps a bead necklace might be worn as tokens of affection or family memory. Women sometimes braided colored threads into their hair when metal ornaments were beyond reach. For the average Roman, adornment was less about wealth and more about identity, signaling family, trade, or community ties. The importance of clothing lay not in fashion, but in what it quietly communicated: belonging, decency, and the desire to be recognized as a member of the wider Roman world. Even patched wool spoke a language of survival, perseverance, and pride in remaining part of the empire's vast, bustling order. For common Romans, leisure was rare but deeply valued. after long days of labor in fields, workshops, or marketplaces. Moments of diversion were needed to soften the harsh edges of survival. Entertainment, however, was not only about spectacle in grand arenas. It also unfolded in small, familiar rhythms within neighborhoods and families. The famous gladiatorial games drew crowds from every walk of life. Even the poorest citizens could sometimes gain free entry, as emperors often sponsored games to win favor. For an ordinary spectator, sitting high in the stone tiers of the Colosseum, the experience was not just about bloodshed, but about belonging. The roar of thousands, the distant clash of steel, and the thrill of watching events larger than life gave a sense of shared identity in a sprawling empire. Still, not every Roman could attend such grand events regularly. Many found their entertainment in simpler ways. Taverns, scattered across towns, became hubs of social life. They were noisy, smoky, and often filled with the clatter of dice games. Gambling was technically restricted, but dice made of bone or clay circulated freely, and wagers were placed on everything from games to street races. A few coins could vanish quickly, but the laughter, arguments, and companionship in these cramped spaces gave relief from monotony. Music, too, colored daily life. Street performers with flutes, tambourines, or simple string instruments would gather small crowds. Children clapped along, while adults paused to listen during errands. In villages, festivals tied to the agricultural calendar, harvest celebrations, sowing rituals, or local religious feasts, so occurred rare moments where even the humblest citizen could sing, dance, and feel part of a community. Joy. Theaters were another beloved escape. Although comedies and tragedies often catered to wealthier audiences, common people could sometimes enjoy performances in open-air venues or temporary wooden stages. Laughter at exaggerated characters, or awe at a myth retold, brought collective delight. In coastal towns, mimes and acrobats performed for coins, turning dusty squares into impromptu stages. In quieter moments, leisure took smaller forms. A family might gather to share stories by lamplight, or neighbors might sit outside their insula on warm evenings, exchanging gossip while children played. Knucklebone Zan, ancient game resembling dice, was popular among both young and old, requiring little more than carved bone pieces. For soldiers on leave or traders waiting at ports, these games were portable companions against boredom. For ordinary Romans, leisure was not an escape from poverty or hardship, but a way to reclaim humanity amidst it. Whether in the grandeur of the Colosseum or the simplicity of a dice game in a tavern corner, entertainment stitched moments of joy into lives otherwise marked by toil. Religion was not distant or abstract in the Roman world. It lived in every street corner, doorway, and household. For ordinary Romans, faith was less about lofty philosophy and more about daily ritual. Small gestures meant to keep the unseen powers content and protective. In almost every home, even the humblest insula, a small shrine called a lararium stood in a niche or corner. Painted figures of the household gods, the Lares and Penates, watched over family and hearth. Each morning, before heading to labor, a few drops of wine, a crumb of bread, or a pinch of incense might be offered. These rituals were simple, but deeply binding. A family that honored its spirits felt safer, believing their walls and food were guarded by forces greater than themselves. At crossroads in towns and villages, small altars often bore wreaths or offerings left by passers-by. Travelers paused to mutter a prayer, asking protection from thieves or storms. Farmers walking to fields might salute the genius loci, the spirit of the place, believing it guarded their land. Religion was less about formal worship and more about weaving sacredness into every step of the day. Festivals punctuated the year, tying personal devotion to the wider rhythm of Roman society. The Saturnalia, with its inversion of social order, brought moments of joy for common folk. Slaves were allowed to sit at table with masters, and small gifts exchanged hands for those who lived their lives at the mercy of harsher hierarchies. Such celebrations offered rare relief and the illusion, however brief, of equality. Ordinary Romans also visited public temples, not just out of piety, but for reassurance. To stand before a massive marble statue of Jupiter or Mars was to feel small, yet connected to the empire's might. Offerings were pragmatic grain, fruit, or small coins, tokens meant to secure favor in return. In times of illness, families left votive objects shaped like body parts at healing temples, hoping divine hands might mend what human healers could not. Superstition, too, lingered everywhere. Amulets against the evil eye dangled from children's necks. Charms inscribed with protective words were hidden in clothing. An unexpected sneeze, a raven's cry, or the stumble of a cart might be read as omens. For the poor, who had little control over famine, disease, or accident, such signs offered both comfort and anxiety, a reminder that the gods' moods might shift at any time. Religion gave ordinary people not just structure, but also belonging. To share in sacrifices, to walk in processions, or to kneel before the same gods as senators and emperors meant that even the humblest citizen was part of a cosmic order. Whether they truly believed or simply performed the rituals to ward off bad fortune, faith remained an anchor in lives often unsettled by uncertainty. So, as we step back from the grandeur of temples and the flickering lamps of household shrines, one truth stands out. Religion was not a distant sphere reserved for priests and philosophers. It was lived in daily gestures, woven into bread shared at the table, into the whispered prayer at a crossroads, into the protective charm tucked beneath a child's tunic. For ordinary Romans, the gods were constant companions, sometimes stern, sometimes generous, but always present. This steady presence of the divine gave meaning to life's uncertainties, a rhythm of sacredness that paralleled the rhythm of labor and survival. Faith, whether born of reverence or fear, was a thread no family could ignore. And yet, behind these public rituals and shared festivals, there lay another, quieter world, the private sphere, where Romans truly lived their lives. If temples and altars represented the empire's collective heart, then the home, however grand or humble, was the true center of existence. It was here that the ordinary person worked, ate, raised children, told stories by lamplight, and endured both hardship and joy. Let us now step through the doorway of an ordinary Roman household. The bustling streets and temple courtyards fade behind us. Inside, we find the warmth of cooking fires, the scent of oil and bread, the murmur of voices, and the rhythm of family life. Here, in these modest rooms, the great empire reveals itself not in marble monuments but in the ordinary patterns of survival and intimacy. Imagine for a moment that you are entering a modest Roman domus in a provincial town or a simple insula apartment in Rome itself. The noise of the street's vendors calling out, carts rumbling across the cobblestones, dogs barking fades as you step through the doorway. Inside, a different rhythm takes over, one marked not by the clamor of empire, but by the hum of domestic survival. The air is thick with the mingled scents of olive oil, wood smoke, damp stone, and, at times, the sharp temps of garum, the fermented fish sauce Romans used in cooking. The floor beneath your feet may be hard-packed earth in a poor family's dwelling, or simple mosaics in a slightly wealthier home. Light filters in unevenly. In an insula, tiny windows admit only narrow shafts of daylight, leaving corners in perpetual shadow. In better homes, an open atrium roof allows sunlight and rain alike to fall into a central basin, where water collects for household use. Sounds are ever present: the crackle of the hearth, the clatter of pottery, the voices of children playing or quarreling, the soft swish of fabric as women spin wool. In the background, faint noises drift in from the city outside, a neighbor's footsteps, the cry of a seller passing in the street, the distant clang of iron from a blacksmith's forge. Here, In these close quarters, family life unfolds. The Roman home was more than shelter, it was a space of constant negotiation between hunger and satiety, between duty and affection, between work and rest. The furniture is simple, a few wooden stools, perhaps a small table, and sleeping arrangements that vary from rough pallets of straw to more structured wooden frames with blankets. The wealthy might have couches for reclining at meals, but for the average person, dining was seated or even crouched. The walls, often plastered, sometimes bore faded decorations, traces of red paint, crude drawings scratched by children, or Christian symbols discreetly carved when the empire shifted in its faith. As night approaches, oil lamps sputter to life, their flames fed by olive oil. Shadows leap against the walls, and the family gathers together, seeking warmth both from the fire and from each other. In this dim space, daily routines, cooking, sewing, storytelling, teaching children their first words were carried out in an intimacy that defined survival in the empire. At the head of nearly every Roman household stood the paterfamilias, the male head of the family. His authority was immense, both practical and symbolic. In law, he held patria potestas, the power of the father. This meant he controlled property, finances, and, in theory, even the lives of his children, while in reality affection and custom softened these rights. The principle remained: the paterfamilias embodied stability, continuity, and the family's honor. He oversaw when and how business was conducted, whether that meant negotiating rents, buying grain, or arranging marriages for his children. In modest homes, he might work alongside his family in a trade, baking bread, crafting shoes, or selling goods in the market. In wealthier households, his duties leaned more toward supervision and public obligations. His presence in the home was both a reassurance and a reminder of the order that underpinned Roman society. Beside him, though often less acknowledged in official records, was the maid. Roman matrons carried enormous responsibility for the daily rhythm of the household. She managed supplies, ensuring there was enough grain to grind into flour, olive oil to cook with, and clothing for her children. She supervised slaves or servants, if the family could afford them, directing their work in cooking, cleaning, or weaving. Her most constant work, however, was textile production. Spinning and weaving were considered the duties of Roman women across all classes. A matron might be found with a spindle in hand from dawn to dusk, producing the woolen garments that clothed her family. Even wealthy women, who could delegate the labor, were expected to demonstrate some skill with textiles as a sign of virtue and diligence. Beyond labor, the materfamilias was the emotional center of the household, mediating quarrels between siblings, guiding daughters toward womanhood, and passing down practical wisdom about herbs, food, and health. Children in Roman families were seen both as blessings and responsibilities. From birth, survival was uncertain. Infants were swaddled tightly, cared for by their mother, older siblings, or sometimes a hired wet nurse. As they grew, their roles diverged sharply along gender lines. Boys were prepared for eventual work or public life. Even in humble families, fathers taught sons the skills of their trade, or, if possible, arranged for apprenticeships. In wealthier households, boys learned Latin and Greek, studied arithmetic, and memorized moral lessons from great writers. Girls, meanwhile, mirrored their mothers. They were taught how to spin, weave, cook, and manage a household. By their early teens, many girls were betrothed, their futures tied to alliances that extended beyond their immediate family. Still, in the small, crowded rooms of daily life, children played with clay dolls, wooden carts, or knucklebones. Their laughter and chatter filled the spaces between chores, offering moments of lightness in households often weighed down by labor. No Roman family was complete without acknowledging the role of the elderly. Grandparents, when they lived long enough, remained part of the household, contributing in quieter but no less important ways. They shared stories of ancestors, preserved traditions, and sometimes provided childcare while younger adults worked. Their presence linked the living family to its past, reinforcing a sense of continuity. In addition, freedmen, clients, or distant relatives sometimes shared these tight domestic spaces. The household was rarely a closed unit, but a shifting network of obligations and relationships. The Roman day began early, often at dawn. In the narrow streets of towns, one could hear shutters creaking open, water being fetched, and the muffled thud of millstones grinding grain. Inside the home, women or servants prepared the first simple meal, usually a piece of bread dipped in wine or olive oil. The paterfamilias might set out for business in the forum, a workshop, or the fields, depending on his station. Children were stirred awake, and, if of school age, sent off with wax tablets and styluses to the grammaticus, while younger ones stayed close to their mother, learning household tasks. For many, the home itself doubled as a workplace. Artisans carved, hammered, or stitched near the entry, where customers could see their craft. Bakers turned grain into loaves for both the family and neighbors. Even a simple apartment in an insula could host small-scale commerce, selling olive oil, pottery, or cloth. Inside, women busied themselves with spinning and weaving. The steady whir of a spindle and the rhythmic beat of a loom became part of the soundscape of Roman domestic life. These were not merely chores, but essential economic contributions. Clothing, sacks, and blankets all came from these labors. By midday, work slowed. Shops closed their shutters, and families gathered for the prandium, the second, slightly larger meal of the day. It was rarely elaborate cold bread, cheese, olives, or leftovers from the previous night, but it provided a needed pause. Children returned from lessons, often eager to repeat the fables or lines of poetry they had memorized. Elders offered corrections, smiling at mistakes. In these moments, the home was not just a shelter, but a small school of daily discipline. Afternoons often turned to the tasks of maintaining the living space. Walls were swept, ashes from hearths carried out, and bedding shaken or aired. In urban apartments, where space was cramped and walls grew smoky from oil lamps, constant cleaning was necessary. Those who had access to water might scrub clothes in tubs, beating them against stones, while others queued at public fountains or laundries. Repairs, whether patching a cloak, mending sandals, or fixing a broken pot, were common sights in Roman homes. As light softened, families began preparing for their main meal, the cena. This was not only nourishment, but also the center of family life. Even humble families treated the cena as a time to gather, exchange stories, and affirm their bonds. Meals began with simple starters, perhaps eggs, olives, or small fish, followed by stews or roasted meats, if fortune allowed. In poorer households, it might simply be porridge flavored with vegetables and herbs. Bread, always bread, was the staple that filled the belly. As the paterfamilias reclined on a stool or bench, children sat upright, listening to conversations that ranged from trade gossip to memories of ancestral customs. Candles or oil lamps were lit, casting flickering shadows on plastered walls. Evenings also drew in others, neighbors dropping by, clients seeking favor, or freedmen returning to offer loyalty to their former masters. These small visits blurred the line between private and public life. In Rome, the household was never entirely sealed off. It was part of a larger web of obligations, friendships, and expectations. As twilight dimmed, shutters were pulled closed to keep out the chill of the evening and the noise of the streets. The bustle of the city softened into the occasional bark of a dog or the distant call of vendors selling the last of their goods. Inside, the household grew quieter, with children finishing small tasks, gathering kindling, sweeping the hearth, or folding spare garments. Oil lamps were carefully trimmed and lit, their small flames fed by olive oil. They gave off a faint hiss and a steady glow, but also a faint smell of smoke and oil that clung to plastered walls. Families without the means for plentiful oil relied on a single flame, setting it near the center of the room so that all could share in its light. Wealthier homes might have several lamps, their bronze or clay shapes casting patterned shadows across walls and ceilings. For many families, night was the time for small rituals. A libation might be poured to the household gods, the Lares and Penates, whose shrines stood in niches near the hearth. Parents whispered brief prayers for protection through the night, asking that fire, illness, or misfortune not intrude. Children watched closely, learning gestures they would one day repeat in their own homes. Superstitions also shaped this hour. Some households hung amulets or charms near doorways to ward off spirits believed to roam at night. The Romans feared what was unseen, and simple gestures, a sprig of laurel, a murmured phrase, gave comfort before sleep. Beds were simple, wooden frames strung with ropes, covered with straw or stuffed mattresses. Linen sheets, wool blankets, or furs provided warmth, depending on the season. In poorer homes, mats of woven reeds or straw spread on the floor sufficed. Before lying down, bedding was shaken to rid it of dust or pests. Children often slept together, wrapped under a shared cover, while parents had their own space. In small apartments, privacy was rare, and the rhythm of breathing bodies filled the room like a soft hum. Even as most settled, the household was never entirely at rest. Someone might keep a small flame burning to tend the fire, ensuring there would be embers in the morning. In larger homes, slaves rotated duties, checking doors, keeping watch, or being ready if their master called. In the countryside, farmers sometimes rose in the night to check livestock, for wolves or thieves posed constant threats. Gradually, silence thickened. The lamp flickered lower as its oil burned down. The air grew heavy with the smell of wool, straw, smoke, and the faint sweetness of herbs that some scattered beneath bedding to ward off insects. Conversations dwindled into whispers, then ceased altogether. At last, the Roman household surrendered to the rhythm of night. Dreams, rest, and silence carried them until dawn, when the cycle would begin again with roosters and the bustle of morning streets. In those final hours, before deep sleep, there was a shared stillness that tied together every household of the Roman world. Whether in a crowded insula in the city or a modest farmstead under the open stars, the routines ended much the same. The lamp fading, the fire sinking low, voices trailing off into silence. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of surrender and acceptance that the labors of the day had passed, and that the night, mysterious and ungovernable, must be allowed its reign. Families breathed in unison, their chests rising and falling in the same measured rhythm, as though the house itself were exhaling along with them. Beyond the shuttered windows, the city still lived in faint murmurs, distant carts rolling over stone, the echo of footsteps, the faint clamor of a tavern where the night lingered longer. But inside, the household closed itself off from the world, trusting that sleep would carry them safely toward morning. And so, within those quiet walls, an ordinary Roman family slipped fully into rest, wrapped in the warmth of wool, the glow of fading embers, and the soft protection of their household gods. The day was ended, and tomorrow would bring its demands. For now, there was only peace, the hush of breath, and the quiet certainty that life, in its cycles, would continue. And so, we have drifted together through the quiet rhythms of ordinary Roman life. We have stepped into their homes, listened to the hush of their evenings, and felt the stillness that carried them from work to rest. What is most striking is how familiar it all seems. Even across the centuries, families gathered, lamps dimmed, voices softening before night took its hold. It reminds us that, for all the grandeur of emperors and conquests, history is most alive in the small details. The clatter of wooden bowls, the whisper of fabric drawn close, the fire sinking slowly to ash. These were the truths that shaped life far more than the battles or speeches written in marble. Now, as you listen in this quiet moment, allow yourself to settle the same way they once did, letting the weight of the day fall away, and trusting that rest will come gently. And when we meet again, we'll wander into another forgotten corner of the past, uncovering details that surprise us, truths that remind us how human history has always been woven from the simplest moments. For now, breathe deeply, close your eyes, and let the soft hush of ancient life carry you into sleep. Good night.